The sun hung low in the sky as the car rumbled down the winding dirt road, its tires kicking up a fine cloud of dust behind it. Emma sat in the back seat, staring out the window at the tall trees surrounding them, the shadows stretching long across the uneven ground. The trees seemed to close in, making her feel small and insignificant. The air in the car was thick with tension, and her heart pounded in her chest as she clutched the edge of her wheelchair. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips, each beat louder than the last. She looked at her mother's hands on the steering wheel. They were stiff, gripping the leather with a force that made Emma's stomach churn. Her mother hadn't said a word since they left the house. Usually, the silence between them was comfortable, almost normal, but today it felt off, like something was about to happen, something she couldn't quite understand. "Mom, where are we going?" Emma's voice trembled, barely above a whisper. Her stomach twisted into knots. Her mother's gaze flickered toward her for a brief second, and Emma noticed the tightness around her lips. "We're just going to the woods, Emma. You'll be fine." Emma blinked, confused. The woods? That didn't make sense. They never went to the woods. Not since Emma's accident. Her wheelchair was a constant reminder of the life she couldn't lead, of the things she couldn't do. She had never ventured this far into the forest before. "Why?" Emma pressed, trying to sit up straighter despite the weight of her disability pulling her back. Her mother's voice was cold when she answered, like she was trying to hide something. "It'll be good for you. You need to be stronger. You'll learn something out here." The word stung. Stronger. Was that all her mother saw her as, a problem to be fixed? Emma had long stopped trying to get her mother's approval, but hearing those words still hurt. What did she mean, learn something? What could she possibly learn out here? The car slowed, the tires crunching over the gravel as they turned off the main road and into the forest. The trees seemed to swallow them whole, and Emma's heart skipped a beat. She could see nothing but the endless sea of green, tall trees, thick vines, and a sky barely visible through the canopy above. The air smelled earthy and damp, but there was something unsettling about it. The closer they got to the deeper parts of the woods, the more Emma's unease grew. "Mom, where are we really going?" Emma asked again, her voice shaking. Her mother didn't answer right away. She simply continued to drive, her eyes focused ahead, never looking at Emma. The sound of the engine seemed to echo in the silence between them, and Emma's hands tightened around the arms of her wheelchair. Finally, the car came to a stop. Emma's stomach dropped. "Get out," her mother said flatly, her tone sharp and unyielding. Emma froze. "What? What do you mean?" Her mother didn't look at her as she opened the door and stepped out of the car, her boots crunching on the dry earth beneath her. She didn't say another word as she slammed the door shut behind her. Emma sat in the back seat, staring at the closed door in disbelief. "Mom?" Emma called, her voice barely audible over the sound of her racing heartbeat. Her mother didn't turn back. She didn't even look over her shoulder. She just walked away, disappearing into the thick woods, her figure swallowed by the shadows of the trees. Emma's breath hitched in her throat. Her hands trembled as they gripped the sides of her wheelchair, trying to steady herself. She was alone. No, not just alone, abandoned. Left in the woods, her mother's cold words echoing in her mind. "You'll be fine." How could she be fine? She could barely move without her wheelchair, and here she was, stranded miles from the safety of her home. Emma's chest tightened, and she fought to keep her panic at bay. She could still hear her mother's footsteps fading away, each one a cruel reminder of her sudden departure. What had she done wrong? Was she not enough? Or had she simply become a burden? The weight of the situation began to settle on her. Her hands shook as she reached for the door handle, but her body screamed in protest. How could she get out of the car without help? Without the strength to navigate the rugged terrain, Emma felt hopeless. She stared at the road ahead, the trees towering on either side, as if daring her to leave the safety of the car. There was no one around. No one to help her. Her mind raced, thoughts clashing with each other. Was her mother coming back? Was this a test? But no, Emma knew deep down that her mother wasn't coming back. This wasn't some strange lesson in survival. This was something darker. A final decision had been made. Emma's existence, her needs, had become too much for her mother to handle. She tried to breathe, to steady her shaking hands, but it was no use. Her heart pounded, and her breath came in short, quick bursts. The woods outside the car seemed to close in around her, suffocating her, pressing her into a corner. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the tears come, even though she knew there was no one there to see them. "I'll be fine," she whispered to herself, trying to believe it, trying to force herself to calm down. But the words felt hollow, empty, like a lie she was telling herself to survive. After a long moment, Emma took a deep breath and wiped her eyes. Her mother's absence was a painful reality, but now Emma had no choice but to face it. She couldn't sit here forever. The woods weren't going to wait for her to gather her strength. If she wanted to survive, she had to move. Her heart pounded in her chest as she slowly pushed the door open, wincing at the cold air that rushed in. She could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders as she maneuvered her wheelchair to the edge of the car. Her legs felt weak, and her hands trembled as she tried to move, but she had to keep going. There was no other choice. And then she saw it. A figure, just a glimpse at first, a shadow among the trees. Someone or something was watching her. Her breath caught in her throat. What was that? Who was that? Her instincts screamed at her to be cautious, to retreat back into the car. But something inside her, the part that refused to give up, told her to move forward. With her heart racing and her mind spinning, Emma took her first step into the unknown, uncertain of what would come next, but knowing that she had no choice but to face it. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Emma's mind raced as she pushed herself away from the car, her hands gripping the wheels of her chair with shaky determination. She had no idea where to go, but sitting still, waiting for her mother to come back, waiting for something that might never happen, wasn't an option. Each push of her hands against the ground made her feel more and more disconnected from the world she once knew. The woods were silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the far-off call of a bird. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long, sharp shadows that seemed to make the trees look even more menacing. It was a far cry from the comforting warmth of her home, where she had once felt safe, safe from her mother's cold words, from the harsh reality of her disability, from the world that felt so cruel and unyielding. But out here in the wild expanse of the woods, safety was a distant memory. Emma gritted her teeth as she maneuvered the wheels of her chair, her arms burning from the effort. The path was uneven, full of rocks and roots that seemed to taunt her at every turn. Every time she thought she had made some progress, the chair would snag on a root, throwing her off balance. She'd have to stop, adjust, and push again. It was exhausting, both physically and emotionally, but there was no other choice. She couldn't stop now. She wiped the sweat from her brow, gritting her teeth against the sharp pain in her muscles. She felt weak, her body's frailty betraying her as the weight of her disability pressed down on her like a stone. Her heart beat faster in her chest, a sharp reminder of her helplessness. She had always been different. She had always been the girl who couldn't run as fast as the others, the girl who couldn't play the way kids her age were supposed to. She was the one who needed help getting out of bed, the one who relied on a chair to get from one place to another. And now she was alone, abandoned. As she rolled along, Emma's thoughts drifted back to her childhood. She had never been the kind of child who needed constant attention, but her mother had always kept her at a distance. There were no hugs, no smiles. There were no words of encouragement, no assurances that everything would be okay. She remembered her mother's face, cold and impassive as she had watched Emma struggle. There was no compassion, no tenderness. It was as if Emma were just a burden to her, an obligation that she couldn't escape. And yet, Emma had always tried to prove herself worthy. She had always tried to be good enough for her mother, to be someone who could make her proud. But the older she got, the more she realized that nothing she did could ever change the way her mother looked at her. She was always the child who needed help, the child who couldn't do things on her own. Now, that rejection was clearer than ever. The memory stung. Emma had tried for years to make her mother love her, but nothing worked. She had tried everything, from the small victories to the big achievements, school grades, sports accomplishments, even trying to be more independent, but nothing ever seemed to matter. Her mother's coldness had always been there, a constant weight hanging over her. Emma stopped for a moment, wiping away fresh tears. She hated the weakness that came with them, hated that she couldn't stop herself from crying. She was better than this. She had to be. She glanced around the woods again, her eyes scanning the horizon. There was no sign of anyone. No sign of her mother, who had abandoned her, or anyone else who could help her. She was truly on her own, and the weight of that truth was enough to make her feel small and insignificant in the vastness of the forest. But even as the despair threatened to swallow her whole, she couldn't allow herself to stay down for long. Not here. Not in the woods. Not when her survival depended on moving forward. Emma wiped her face and set her jaw, pushing the chair forward once more. She couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. Even if her body screamed for rest, even if her heart felt like it was breaking with every turn of the wheels. She had to keep going. And then, something caught her eye. A flicker of movement in the trees. Emma froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Was it her mother? Had she come back? No, that didn't make sense. She wouldn't just leave without a word, without any explanation. Another movement, this time clearer, a shadow darting between the trees. Emma's breath hitched, and she quickly wheeled herself to the side, hiding behind a thick cluster of shrubs. She didn't know who or what she was dealing with, but she wasn't about to take any chances. The woods were unfamiliar, and the last thing she needed right now was a stranger, especially someone who might pose a danger. Her mind raced. What should she do? Should she call out? Should she hide? She couldn't move fast enough to outrun anyone if they were dangerous. She was vulnerable out here, completely exposed. For a long, tense moment, there was nothing but silence. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow. She felt like she was being watched, but she couldn't see anyone. She craned her neck, trying to catch a glimpse of whoever or whatever was in the woods with her. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something. A figure, barely visible, standing still between two trees. It wasn't moving. It wasn't coming closer. It was just watching her. Emma's heart skipped a beat. The figure didn't seem threatening, but the uncertainty of it all made her skin crawl. She couldn't make out details, just a vague outline, tall and thin, hidden in the trees. Was it a person? Or was it just a trick of the light? The figure stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, and Emma's breath caught in her throat. And then, slowly, the figure turned and disappeared deeper into the woods, leaving Emma to wonder if it had even been real at all. She stayed still, holding her breath, waiting to see if it would return. But after a few moments, she was left with nothing but the quiet rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. Emma slowly exhaled, trying to steady her racing heart. Who had been out there? Was it someone who could help? Or was it just a shadow in the woods, nothing more than her mind playing tricks on her? She didn't know. She couldn't be sure of anything anymore. But for the first time since her mother had abandoned her, Emma felt a spark of something, a strange mixture of fear and hope. She wasn't completely alone. There was someone, or something, out there watching her. The air felt thick as Emma sat still, her wheelchair nestled in the underbrush, her hands gripping the wheels with tension. She could still feel the presence of the figure, even though it had vanished into the trees. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled as her mind ran wild with questions. Who was it? What did they want? Was it her mother, come back to take her home? Or was it someone dangerous, someone who meant her harm? She pushed the thoughts aside, forcing herself to focus. No matter who or what was out there, she needed to keep moving. She couldn't afford to sit in the woods, paralyzed by fear. She had no idea what time it was, but the light was fading quickly, the sky darkening with the approach of night. She had to find shelter, something to keep her safe. The thought of being out in the open as the darkness closed in made her feel like prey, vulnerable and exposed. With a deep breath, Emma turned her wheelchair in the direction she thought would lead her deeper into the forest. The sounds of the woods were still unfamiliar to her, the chirping of insects, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the far-off call of an owl. She pushed forward, her muscles aching, her hands raw from the constant strain. She had no plan, no destination in mind. She simply moved, hoping to find something, anything, that could offer her protection. The woods were dense, the trees towering above her, their branches weaving together to block out much of the fading sunlight. The path was uneven, with rocks and roots threatening to derail her at every turn. She had to stop every few moments, adjusting the wheels, repositioning herself, and catching her breath. Her mind kept drifting back to the figure she had seen earlier. Had it been a person? It didn't seem like a person, not entirely. There was something wrong about it, something that made her skin crawl. It had been too still, too quiet. No normal person would just stand motionless like that in the woods, especially not with someone like her around. Emma shook her head, trying to focus on the present. She couldn't afford to let fear get the best of her. She had to survive. She had to find a way out of this mess. But the longer she rolled through the woods, the more the weight of her situation pressed down on her. Her mother had left her. She had been abandoned, left alone in the wilderness to fend for herself. And as much as she wanted to hold on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, her mother would come back for her, Emma knew deep down that she couldn't wait. If she waited, she would die out here. She pushed forward, the ache in her chest growing stronger as she battled with the reality of her situation. She wasn't just physically disabled, she was emotionally scarred, too. Her mother's rejection had left her with a hole that no one, nothing, could fill. It was as though she had been forgotten by the one person she needed most. Suddenly, a movement caught her eye. There it was again, the figure. Just beyond a cluster of trees, its outline barely visible in the dimming light. This time, it was closer, and Emma could make out more details. A tall figure, cloaked in shadows, standing at the edge of a small clearing. Emma's breath hitched. She froze, her pulse quickening. The figure was definitely watching her now, but it didn't make any move toward her. It simply stood there, as if waiting, as if expecting something. Her first instinct was to call out, to demand answers, but she stopped herself. Was this a person she could trust? Or was it the same shadow that had watched her earlier? The figure took a slow step forward, the silhouette shifting slightly. Emma instinctively pushed her wheelchair back into the cover of the bushes, her heart pounding in her ears. She held her breath, barely daring to move. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure turned and disappeared into the trees. Emma's eyes widened. It was gone. For a moment, Emma considered calling out, asking who it was, but the thought made her hesitate. What if it was a trick? What if it was some sort of cruel game? There was too much at stake for her to risk making a mistake. She had learned that the hard way. Her mother's rejection had taught her the painful lesson that not everyone could be trusted. She waited for several minutes, listening for any sign of movement. But the woods were silent again. The only sound was the wind rustling through the leaves. Against her better judgment, Emma decided to move forward. She needed to find shelter before nightfall, and the figure, whatever it was, wasn't there anymore. She couldn't let herself get sidetracked by shadows and half-formed figures in the trees. Emma rolled slowly through the woods, careful not to make too much noise. She couldn't afford to attract attention. Each rustle of the leaves seemed louder than the last. The sinking sun cast long, eerie shadows, and the further she traveled, the more the woods seemed to press in on her. Her mind wandered again. Was there anyone else out here? Could there be other survivors? Other people who had been abandoned like her? She had no idea how to find them, though. She had never been good at navigating. Her wheelchair made it even harder to keep up with the twists and turns of the forest. As she wheeled forward, she noticed something unusual up ahead, a faint glimmer of light in the distance. At first, she thought it might be the moon breaking through the trees, but it seemed too steady, too focused. It was like a lantern or the flicker of a fire. Emma's heart leaped in her chest. Could it be someone? Someone who could help her? She steered her wheelchair toward the light, the path growing steeper and more treacherous with each turn. The light grew brighter as she approached, and soon she could make out the shape of a small campfire, its orange glow flickering in the shadows. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she neared the clearing. She had found something, someone. Her heart raced as she rolled closer, not sure what to expect. And then she saw him. A man sitting by the fire, his back turned toward her. He seemed to be alone. His clothes were rugged, worn as though he had been out here for some time. He didn't hear her approach, and Emma hesitated, unsure of what to do. Should she speak? Should she keep her distance? Before she could decide, the man turned, his eyes locking onto hers. His face was weathered and rough, but there was something about his gaze that made her pause. He didn't seem startled or afraid. He simply looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice low and calm, almost too calm for the situation. Emma's throat tightened as she tried to answer, but the words caught in her chest. Could she trust him? Or was this another stranger who might hurt her? He waited, his eyes not leaving hers, as if sensing her hesitation. "I won't bite," he added, with a hint of a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The flicker of the campfire danced between them, casting strange shadows over his face. Emma's heart raced, but she couldn't ignore the flicker of hope that rose in her chest. She wasn't alone anymore. The crackling sound of the fire was the only noise between them. Emma stared at the man, unsure of what to do next. She had heard stories of people who wandered into the woods and never returned. She had heard enough about the dangers of trusting strangers to be cautious. But she couldn't ignore the fact that the firelight in front of her was the first warmth she had felt since she was abandoned in these woods. The man's face was rough, weathered by years of exposure, and his hair was shaggy, falling around his face in untamed waves. His clothes were simple, a faded flannel shirt, worn jeans, and boots that had seen better days. He didn't look dangerous, but appearances could be deceiving. "I won't bite," he repeated, his voice reassuring but still guarded. Emma hesitated for a long moment, her fingers tightening on the wheelchair's wheels. Should she trust him? Should she even approach? She could turn around and leave, try to find another way, but that would mean facing the cold darkness of the woods alone again. I'm not lost," Emma finally managed to say, her voice a little shakier than she intended. I'm just trying to survive." The man nodded slowly, as though he understood. He didn't push her to say more, which Emma appreciated. She wasn't ready to talk about what had happened, about how her mother had abandoned her in the woods and left her to fend for herself. She didn't want to think about it. Instead, she focused on the fire. The warmth of the flames was soothing, and she closed her eyes for a moment, letting the heat wash over her. She hadn't realized how cold she had gotten, how desperately she had been yearning for the comfort of something familiar. The man didn't seem in any rush to speak, but after a few minutes, he motioned toward the campfire. "You hungry?" Emma's stomach growled in response, betraying her. She hadn't eaten anything since early that morning, before everything had gone wrong. The thought of food made her stomach churn with hunger and uncertainty. She didn't know if she should accept his offer. What if it was a trick? What if he was luring her in to harm her? But then again, she had to admit, she didn't have many options. She could turn him down, try to keep going alone, but the thought of wandering further into the woods, without food or shelter, was terrifying. The cold, the fear, and the exhaustion were taking their toll. Finally, after a long, tense pause, Emma nodded. "I could eat something," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. The man stood and began rummaging through his bag, pulling out a small, portable cooking stove and some cans. It was a simple setup, but it looked like he had been out here for a while and knew how to survive in the wild. He cracked open a can of beans, and the smell of warm food filled the air. "You don't have to talk about it," he said, glancing over at her as he started to heat the beans. "But I've been out here for a long time. The woods, they're not as empty as people think." Emma didn't respond right away, but his words made her think. She had always imagined the forest as a place of solitude, something to avoid. But maybe it wasn't as empty as she had believed. Maybe there were others who had found themselves lost, or abandoned, or simply struggling to survive. The man's voice was calm, soothing even. It wasn't like the harsh, cold voice of her mother, the one that had left her behind. This man didn't seem to judge her, didn't seem to care about her disability. He didn't seem to be looking for anything from her except companionship, or maybe just a shared moment in the middle of the wild. "I've been out here for 6 months," the man continued, his voice distant as he stirred the beans. "Came here to escape. My life, it wasn't much better than the woods. I thought I could disappear. Thought maybe if I was alone, I could finally find peace." Emma listened, intrigued by the stranger's words. She wasn't sure if she believed him. Who just dropped everything and disappeared into the woods? Who left everything behind? And why? "How did you get here?" Emma asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. The man let out a soft chuckle, but it wasn't a happy sound. More like the kind of laugh someone makes when they don't know how to answer a question. "Does it matter?" he asked, eyes glancing toward her. "I guess it does. But I don't have any easy answers. Sometimes life forces you into the wild, whether you want it or not. Sometimes it's easier to disappear than to face the things that are chasing you." Emma didn't ask him to explain further. She wasn't sure if she wanted to know. The idea of disappearing into the woods, leaving behind everything, was both comforting and terrifying at the same time. There was something freeing about it, but she also knew that even out here, the world would still find her. The weight of her disability, of the things she had faced, would follow her wherever she went. The man handed her a can of beans once they were ready, and Emma took it gratefully. The warmth of the food made her feel a little better, a little more human. She hadn't realized how desperately she had needed this small kindness. They ate in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Emma's mind wandered as she took bite after bite. The stranger seemed harmless enough, but he wasn't what she had expected. She had thought that being abandoned in the woods meant she would meet someone dangerous, someone who would try to take advantage of her. But this man didn't seem like that. There was a quiet sadness to him, a kind of resignation that Emma couldn't quite place. The silence between them was comfortable, but still, Emma's mind wouldn't let her forget why she was here. She had to survive. She had to find a way to get out of this mess. But the longer she sat there, the more she realized how much she needed this moment of peace. How much she needed to not be alone. When she finished eating, the man took the empty cans and tossed them into his bag. He turned back to the fire, poking at the flames with a stick. "You can stay here tonight," he said, glancing over at her. "If you need to. It's not much, but it's safer than out there." He gestured vaguely toward the woods behind them, where the shadows were already deepening with the night. Emma looked at him, surprised by his offer. She hadn't expected someone to extend kindness to her like this, not after everything that had happened. But maybe, just maybe, this stranger could offer her something her mother never had: compassion. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice filled with a mixture of gratitude and skepticism. She didn't know if she should trust him, but she knew she needed the safety of the fire. "At least for tonight." The man nodded, the corners of his mouth turning up slightly. "I know what it's like to be alone out here," he said softly. "I know what it's like to feel abandoned. You don't have to be alone anymore." Emma looked into the fire, the warmth seeping into her bones. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The night was colder than Emma had anticipated, but the warmth of the fire and the comfort of a roof, albeit a small, makeshift one made of tarps and branches, offered a sense of security she hadn't felt in days. As she sat close to the flames, the stranger, whose name she still hadn't asked, stoked the fire with practiced ease, keeping the embers bright. The shadows of the forest pressed in around them, but for once, Emma didn't feel entirely alone. The man hadn't said much after offering her shelter, and Emma didn't push him to speak either. She wasn't sure what to say. How did one start a conversation with someone who was essentially a stranger, who, like her, seemed to be running from something? "Why are you out here?" Emma found herself asking, breaking the silence. She hadn't meant to ask, but the question had been gnawing at her ever since they sat down to eat. She needed to understand. Why had he come into the woods to live alone? The man didn't immediately respond, his fingers absent-mindedly pushing the logs around in the fire. For a moment, Emma thought he hadn't heard her, or that he simply didn't want to answer. But then he sighed and leaned back, his gaze flicking to the stars above. "It's not a good story," he finally said, his voice low. "At least, I don't think you'd want to hear it." Emma studied him, trying to decipher the layers in his expression. His eyes were hard, distant, as if something painful lurked just beneath the surface. She could relate. Her own story was one she didn't want to share, didn't want to think about, but she found herself drawn to his vulnerability. Maybe he, too, had been pushed to the brink of something terrible. "I'm not sure there's such a thing as a good story in these woods," Emma said softly. "But maybe it doesn't matter." She paused, trying to push through the awkwardness of the moment. "We're here now, right?" "We're not alone." He looked over at her, and his lips twitched into a faint, knowing smile. For a brief moment, the hardness in his eyes softened, and Emma felt a flicker of understanding pass between them. "I suppose you're right," he said, exhaling slowly as if the weight of the world had just shifted, even if just a little. "I guess I was running from a lot of things. Not just my past, but from myself." Emma nodded, sensing there was more. "What are you running from?" The man paused, his gaze flickering down at the ground for a moment before he spoke again. "A long time ago, I had a family. A wife. A daughter." His voice cracked slightly as he said the words. "But I wasn't the person I needed to be. Not for them. Not for anyone. I was a failure." Emma's breath hitched in her chest. The word failure echoed in her mind, reminding her of the way her mother had left her in the woods, abandoned her to face her own struggles alone. Was that how her mother felt too? Like a failure? Or had she simply given up? "After I left them, I thought the woods would fix me," the man continued. "That the silence, the isolation would make everything clearer. But it doesn't. It just makes you more lost." Emma didn't know how to respond. Part of her wanted to comfort him, to tell him that it wasn't too late to make things right. But another part of her felt bitter. She didn't have the energy to give away sympathy, not when her own heart felt so bruised. Instead, she sat in silence, her mind replaying her mother's abandonment over and over again. She could feel the weight of her own struggles, her own feeling of being lost, but something about hearing his story made her realize that maybe, just maybe, they weren't so different. "So, what now?" Emma asked after a long pause, looking up at him. "What do we do here?" "In the woods, I mean." The man turned to her, his eyes more focused than before, as if the question had drawn him out of his own thoughts. "We survive. That's the first thing," he said simply. "We keep going even when we don't know how. And then, maybe, we find something that makes it all worth it." His words stirred something deep within her. She had been so focused on surviving, on getting by from one day to the next, that she hadn't really thought about why she was doing it. Was it just to exist? To endure the pain of being abandoned? Or was there something more she could find out here, in the wild, something beyond just keeping her head above water? "I don't want to be here forever," Emma said softly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. She hadn't realized just how true they were until she said them. "I don't want to be lost." The man didn't respond right away. He just looked at her, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, Emma thought maybe he hadn't understood her. But then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke again. "No one wants to be lost," he said quietly. "But sometimes, being lost is the only way we can find our way back." His words hung in the air like smoke, thick and heavy, and Emma's heart clenched in response. She wasn't sure if she believed him, but the idea of finding her way back, of not being abandoned, of not being lost anymore sounded too good to dismiss. For the first time since she was left in the woods, Emma allowed herself to entertain the thought of a future, a life beyond the wilderness. But that thought was quickly interrupted by a sudden rustling sound from the edge of the clearing. Emma's body tensed, and she turned to the man, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. The man's expression darkened immediately. His gaze flickered to the trees, then back at her, his hand reaching for something just out of sight. He didn't say anything, but Emma saw the tension in his posture. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," the man said, his tone now low and serious. "But we're not alone." A chill ran through Emma's spine as the sound grew louder. It was unmistakable now, the crackling of dry leaves, the faint shuffle of footsteps in the darkness. Something, or someone, was out there, watching them. The air grew thick with tension as Emma and the man sat in the flickering light of the fire, the rustling sounds from the woods growing louder by the second. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, her fingers gripping the wheels of her wheelchair as if it could somehow protect her from the threat that loomed just beyond the edge of the campfire's glow. The man, still not speaking, subtly shifted his position, moving as though he was ready to spring into action. His hand rested on a weathered, jagged piece of wood that Emma hadn't noticed before. It could have been a weapon or a tool, but at this point, she wasn't asking questions. Whatever it was better than nothing. "What's out there?" Emma whispered, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. The man didn't answer immediately, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. The trees swayed softly in the breeze, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to stretch toward them like fingers. Everything felt wrong. The usual sounds of the forest, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of wind through the leaves were absent now. It was as if the world had gone quiet, holding its breath. "I don't know," the man said, his voice low. "But I've been out here long enough to know when something's not right." Emma could feel the sweat collecting at the back of her neck, her stomach churning with fear. Was it some wild animal? A bear? A predator of some kind? Or was it something worse, someone who had been watching them, waiting for the right moment? Another noise. This time it was closer, unmistakable. A sharp crack of a branch snapping underfoot. Emma's pulse quickened. The footsteps were getting closer. whoever or whatever was out there was approaching them. "Stay calm," the man whispered, barely moving his lips. He didn't sound calm at all, but his voice held authority, like he had faced danger before and survived it. "Stay quiet. Don't make any sudden moves." Emma nodded, barely able to control the shaking in her hands. She felt the chill of the night seeping into her bones, despite the warmth of the fire. It was as if the shadows themselves were closing in on them. And the fear, the overwhelming, suffocating fear was like a weight pressing down on her chest. Then, without warning, the man stood up, gripping the piece of wood like a weapon, his eyes narrowed in the direction of the approaching noise. "Who's out there?" he called out, his voice cutting through the tension. "Show yourself." There was a long silence. Emma strained her ears, her heart racing. She couldn't see anything beyond the dim glow of the fire, but she could feel the eyes of whatever or whoever was watching them. The weight of the silence was unbearable. Then, finally, a voice answered, breaking the tension like a hammer striking glass. "Easy there," the voice said, rough and gravelly, but not unfriendly. "We don't mean any harm." Emma's breath caught in her throat as a figure stepped out of the darkness, slowly emerging from the trees. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a weather-beaten face and wild, unkempt hair. His clothes were worn and torn, but he didn't look like the kind of person Emma had expected. There were no weapons in his hands, no malicious intent in his eyes. Instead, there was a kind of weariness, a strange understanding in his gaze that made Emma's heart skip a beat. "Who are you?" the man beside Emma demanded, still holding the piece of wood in a defensive stance, though his grip had relaxed slightly. The stranger raised his hands in a peaceful gesture, showing that he wasn't armed. "Name's Jack," he said. "I've been living out here for a while now." Jack stepped closer, but not too close. He kept a respectful distance, his eyes flicking toward Emma before returning to the man. "Don't worry. I'm not here to cause trouble," Jack continued, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that only came from years of surviving in the wild. "I saw your fire from a distance. Wasn't sure if you were friendly or not, but figured I'd check it out." Emma couldn't help but feel a strange mixture of relief and suspicion. He seemed harmless enough, but who just wandered into the woods at night, seeking out random campfires? Was he telling the truth, or was this another trap, another cruel game meant to play on her fear? Jack crouched by the fire, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't sit, just hovered near the warmth, his eyes darting around the camp as though checking for something. Or someone. "I don't trust him," Emma whispered to the man beside her, her voice low but anxious. She couldn't hide her unease. Something about Jack felt off, even if he didn't seem threatening. The man nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the newcomer. "I know. But we don't have much of a choice right now, do we?" Jack smiled faintly as if he could hear their conversation, but he didn't respond. Instead, he seemed to be waiting for them to make a decision. The fire crackled between them, the heat from the flames adding to the tension in the air. "So, what do you want?" the man asked, his voice steady despite the situation. Jack didn't immediately answer. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder toward the woods, his expression darkening for a moment. "I'm just passing through," he said finally, his eyes meeting the man's. "I've got my own reasons for being out here. But there are things in these woods you don't want to mess with. People like me, we know the signs. We know when trouble's coming." Emma frowned, her curiosity piqued despite her fears. "What kind of trouble?" Jack glanced at her, a slight smirk playing on his lips. "You don't need to worry about it yet," he said cryptically. "But trust me, if you're planning to stay in these woods, you need to be prepared. There's more out there than you think." The man's gaze shifted between Jack and Emma, a hint of concern in his eyes. He wasn't sure what Jack meant, but there was a quiet warning in his tone that Emma couldn't ignore. Before either of them could respond, there was another sound from the woods, a faint rustle of leaves, followed by something heavy shifting in the underbrush. This time, it wasn't a human sound. The hair on the back of Emma's neck stood up again. "Get behind me," the man said suddenly, pushing Emma's wheelchair closer to the fire. He stood tall, blocking her view of the trees. His protective instincts kicked in. Whatever was coming out of the darkness, he wasn't going to let it reach her. "Get ready," Jack said, his voice low and urgent. "We're not alone anymore." The rustling grew louder, much closer now. Emma's heart was in her throat as she gripped the wheels of her wheelchair, her knuckles turning white. The man stood in front of her, his posture tense, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. The firelight flickered and sputtered, casting eerie shadows on the trees around them. Emma could barely see through the thick darkness, but she could feel something large, moving just out of sight. Jack stood to the side, his eyes scanning the trees, but he didn't make any sudden moves. His face was grim, alert. He, too, knew the dangers the woods could hold. "Stay calm," the man whispered to Emma, his voice steady, but she could hear the underlying urgency. "Whatever it is, we're not going to give it a chance." But Emma was struggling to keep calm. Her pulse raced, her breath quickened, and her mind was full of panic. She wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but wait in the dark for whatever danger was creeping closer. A low growl, deep and guttural, broke the silence, and Emma's blood ran cold. It wasn't the sound of any animal she recognized. It was something wrong. Something that shouldn't exist. The growl seemed to come from all around them, as if the forest itself was alive with menace. "Stay quiet," the man whispered sharply, his eyes scanning the shadows. "It's close." Emma's gaze darted around, searching for any sign of movement. The trees seemed to loom like silent giants, their branches swaying with the wind, but something felt off. There was no other sound, no rustle of leaves or chirp of crickets. Only the heavy silence, thick with anticipation. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by a series of sharp, high-pitched sounds, snapping twigs, the rustling of leaves, and then, in the distance, the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, picking its way through the forest underbrush. The man's hand clenched around the piece of wood he was holding. He shifted slightly, positioning himself in front of Emma. "Get ready," he muttered under his breath. Emma felt the adrenaline pumping through her veins. She didn't know what was out there, but she knew it was coming. She wanted to scream, to tell them both to run, but her mouth felt dry. Fear had a firm grip on her chest. Suddenly, there was a flash of movement. It was fast, too fast. The silhouette of something large darted between the trees, almost like a shadow, moving with unnatural speed. Then it stopped. Emma could hear it breathing, the sound low and raspy, like a creature trying to catch its breath. "Do you see it?" Jack asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I see it," the man replied, his eyes narrowed, watching the shifting shadow carefully. "Stay behind me." Emma's heart was hammering in her chest as the creature moved again, a blur between the trees. She could see the faint outline of it now, a hulking shape, dark and menacing, like something from a nightmare. The low growl rumbled again, closer this time, and Emma could see glowing eyes staring from the dark. It wasn't human, but it wasn't quite like any animal she'd ever seen. Its eyes gleamed with a malevolent intelligence, and for a moment, it seemed to be studying them, sizing them up. The man gripped the makeshift weapon tighter, his stance shifting. He was ready. "What is that?" Emma breathed, her voice trembling with fear. "I don't know," Jack replied, his eyes fixed on the creature. "But whatever it is, it's not alone." And then, before Emma could process what was happening, another growl, this one higher pitched, split the air. And just like that, a second shadow emerged from the darkness, this one slightly smaller, but just as terrifying. The two creatures circled them, their eyes never leaving the trio. The growls intensified, and the tension in the air thickened. The firelight seemed to flicker under their gaze, like it, too, was afraid. The creature stepped closer, moving in a coordinated manner, circling them like predators closing in on their prey. "Stay still," the man ordered. "Don't provoke them." Emma felt frozen to the spot. Her breath was shallow, her heart pounding in her chest. The creatures were close now, too close, and she could see their form more clearly. They had the body of large, wild animals, but there was something off about them. Their fur was matted, dark, and their faces seemed wrong. Their eyes gleamed unnaturally bright, like they were glowing. Their mouths were filled with sharp teeth, and as they bared them in a warning, Emma felt a chill race down her spine. "I told you," Jack muttered. "You shouldn't have come here." The man didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the creatures, calculating, watching their movements. The beasts seemed to be waiting, sensing the fear in the air. They didn't rush in, but they didn't back away either. The tension was unbearable, and Emma's hands were shaking violently. The creature nearest to her lunged suddenly, its claws scraping the earth with a horrifying screech. Before Emma could even scream, the man swung the piece of wood with incredible force, striking the creature in the side. It recoiled with a pained snarl, but didn't back off. Jack stepped forward, his expression cold and determined. "Get ready," he growled, moving to stand alongside the man. "If you want to survive this, you need to trust me. I've dealt with worse." Emma's hands were still shaking, but she didn't hesitate. She watched Jack and the man, both poised for the next move. Whatever these creatures were, they weren't going to make this easy. Another roar split the air, louder than before. The creatures were getting impatient. They were closing in. And then the man made his move. He lunged forward, using his weapon to strike the first creature again, driving it back into the darkness, at least momentarily. Jack followed suit, pulling a knife from his belt and slashing at the other creature, pushing it away with force. But the creatures didn't retreat. They circled back, snarling and growling in the darkness. "We're not going to win this," Jack said grimly, his eyes darting around, calculating their options. "We need to move. Now." The creatures paused for a moment, eyeing their prey. Emma's heart raced as she realized what Jack meant. They couldn't fight forever. They had to run. Before Emma could react, the man grabbed her wheelchair. "Move. Now," he yelled. Without another word, he began pushing her toward the trees, away from the creatures, his movements quick and purposeful. Jack followed, his knife still in hand, watching the creatures as they circled back again, growling in the darkness. "We're not safe yet," the man said. "We need to find shelter. Fast." Emma's mind was racing, her heart still pounding. The creatures were close, their growls reverberating through the trees. She didn't know what kind of monsters they were, but one thing was clear: they were hunting them. And unless they found somewhere to hide, they wouldn't last long. The night had descended deeper into chaos, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and the sharp tang of fear. Emma's mind was still spinning, a storm of confusion and dread clouding her thoughts. The man pushed her wheelchair with frantic speed, his hands gripping the handles with a desperation she could feel in every jolt. Jack followed closely behind, his knife at the ready, his eyes darting over his shoulder every few seconds, ensuring that they weren't being followed too closely. The sounds of the creatures, their growls and low hisses, echoed in the distance, but they were growing fainter, their presence becoming more of a chilling memory with each passing moment. Yet Emma knew, with every fiber of her being, that they weren't safe. "Not yet. Keep moving," the man urged, his voice strained but determined. "We need to get somewhere they can't reach us." Emma's breath came in shallow bursts as she held onto the sides of her wheelchair, trying to steady herself. The physical effort of being pushed through the forest, the constant fear, and the lingering shock of the encounter was wearing her down. Every movement felt like it took more out of her than it should. But there was no time to think about that. Not now. The man was clearly experienced in survival, his focus unshaken by the terror that had surrounded them moments before. His eyes scanned their surroundings with a practiced intensity, as if looking for any sign of danger. The trees around them were dense, their trunks towering above like silent sentinels in the dark. The path was rough, winding, and unpredictable, but he navigated it effortlessly, as though he had spent years in this very forest. "Jack," the man called, never breaking his stride. "Find a shelter. A cave, a rock formation, anything." Jack nodded, his face hard as stone. "Got it." Without another word, he veered off to the side, disappearing into the thick underbrush. Emma's eyes followed him for a moment, but her attention was quickly snapped back to the man, who was still pushing her forward, his face set in grim determination. "Don't worry," he said, though his voice was tight. "Jack knows this forest better than most. He'll find something." Emma could only nod, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The creatures from earlier, they weren't normal. There was something wrong about them. Their eyes, those glowing, otherworldly eyes. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just predators. They were something darker, something that belonged in a nightmare, not in the woods surrounding them. As they continued their frantic pace, Emma noticed something. An eerie quiet had fallen over the forest. The usual sounds of the night had stopped completely. The rustling leaves, the chirping of distant insects, the croak of frogs, all of it had gone silent. Even the wind had stilled, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. "What's happening?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. She couldn't help the panic rising in her chest. Something wasn't right. The darkness felt heavier, more oppressive. The man's expression tightened, his gaze scanning the trees around them with renewed wariness. "Stay alert," he muttered under his breath. "There's something else out here." Before Emma could respond, Jack returned, emerging from the shadows with a sense of urgency in his step. "I found something," he said, his voice low. "This way." Without waiting for a response, Jack turned and pushed forward, and the man quickly followed, guiding Emma's wheelchair with quick, determined movements. The forest began to thin as they moved deeper, the trees spaced further apart. The ground beneath their feet grew uneven, the dirt soft and damp, but they didn't stop. Emma could feel her heart racing faster now, her instincts screaming that whatever Jack had found, they needed to reach it quickly. Then, just ahead, a shape emerged from the shadows, a large rock formation, partially covered in moss and overgrown with vines. It was nestled between two massive trees, and it looked like a natural shelter. A cave of sorts. "This should work," Jack said, his voice low. "It's not much, but it'll hide us for a while." The man nodded, his eyes scanning the trees once more. "Help me get her inside." Jack stepped forward, pulling aside some of the vines to reveal a narrow opening in the rock. It wasn't much of a cave, more of a crevice, really, but it would have to do. The man quickly pushed Emma inside, carefully maneuvering her wheelchair through the small gap. Once inside, the tension in his posture seemed to ease, but only slightly. They weren't out of danger yet. He looked around the dark interior of the cave, assessing it for any immediate threats. "It'll have to do," he said, nodding toward Jack. "We'll stay here until morning. No point in risking it." Jack didn't respond immediately, but he glanced over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he stood guard at the entrance. "We'll see if it holds," he said cryptically. "But don't get too comfortable." The man crouched next to Emma, his face grim. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer now, though still carrying the weight of everything they had just been through. Emma nodded slowly, but she couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over her. The creatures, the silence of the woods, the strange way the night had unfolded, it all felt wrong. She had the nagging feeling that this was just the beginning of something much worse. "I'm fine," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to convince him or herself. "But what's happening out there? What are those things? And why is it so quiet now?" The man hesitated, his gaze distant as he looked out at the blackness beyond the cave. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but I've seen things in these woods before, things I wish I hadn't." Emma could see the pain in his eyes, the burden of memories he didn't want to share. but he didn't push it. We'll figure it out. We're not alone anymore, he said, his voice more determined now. We'll survive this. She wanted to believe him. She really did. But something deep inside her was telling her that survival wouldn't be as simple as he made it sound. The darkness outside, the growls of the creatures, it was all too much. There was something worse lurking in these woods, something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. And Emma had a sinking feeling that whatever it wasn't going to let them go. Not now. Not ever. The hours in the small, dark crevice passed slowly, each one heavier than the last. Emma sat in the cold shadows, her wheelchair tucked into the corner of the cave, eyes scanning the gloom. The flickering light from a small, hastily constructed fire they'd made near the entrance barely pushed back the darkness. Jack was standing at the cave's narrow entrance, his back against the rock wall, knife still in hand, alert and ready. The man, who had yet to give her a name, was sitting on the ground nearby, his head resting against the cool stone, eyes closed but clearly still on edge. The air in the cave was thick with tension, the silence overwhelming. Emma could hear her own breath, shallow and uneven, as if she were afraid that any noise she made would alert the creatures to their hiding place. She couldn't shake the image of those glowing eyes, their sharp teeth, and the way they circled them like they were nothing more than prey. She had no idea what they were, but whatever they were, she could sense that they weren't just after food. There was something malicious about them, something that made her skin crawl. How much longer? She finally asked, breaking the stillness. Her voice echoed in the small space, louder than she had intended. The man didn't answer right away. He was staring at the fire, his brow furrowed. He seemed lost in thought, or perhaps too tired to respond. Emma understood. She had seen the same exhaustion in Jack's eyes, and now she could see it in the man's as well. They were all running on fumes, physically and emotionally drained from everything they had endured in the last 24 hours. "We wait," the man said at last, his voice low but firm. "We can't leave until we're sure they've passed. Those things, they won't stop looking for us." Emma glanced at Jack, who seemed to be studying the forest beyond the cave, his eyes piercing the dark. His hand was still wrapped around the knife handle, his posture rigid. "Are you sure we'll be safe here?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. This doesn't feel right." Jack turned toward her then, his gaze softening for just a moment. "We're safe for now," he said, though the uncertainty in his voice made Emma uneasy. "But we can't stay here forever." "What do you mean?" Emma asked. "Where are we supposed to go?" The man stood up then, stretching his legs and moving to the entrance of the cave. He knelt next to Jack, who moved aside to give him space. The two of them spoke in hushed tones, too quietly for Emma to catch the words. But the tension in their voices was unmistakable. They were talking about something serious, something that made Emma's heart race faster. "Are they still out there?" she asked, unable to keep the question inside. The man didn't turn to her right away. Instead, he stared into the dark, his hand gripping his makeshift weapon tightly. "Yes," he said quietly. "They're still here. And we're not alone in these woods. Something else, something bigger, something older, is watching us." Emma's stomach dropped. She had known that the creatures were dangerous, but to hear that there was something worse out there, that was a thought she couldn't fully wrap her mind around. Her body stiffened at the thought of whatever was lurking just beyond the firelight, waiting for the right moment to strike. "They'll stop looking for us eventually," the man continued. "But we need to be prepared. They'll wait for us to make a move. And then they'll come again." "Wait," Emma interjected, her voice cutting through the tension. "If there's something worse out there, why don't we just leave now? Why wait?" Jack finally turned to her, his eyes grim. "Because if we move now, we'll be walking straight into whatever's out there. We have to be smart." The man nodded, adding, "The longer we wait, the more time we give them to move away. We need to make sure the path is clear before we try to leave. And we need to be careful where we go next." Emma swallowed hard, the weight of the situation sinking in. Her mind was spinning, the uncertainty of their fate pressing down on her like a heavy stone. But she knew Jack and the man were right. Moving blindly now could lead them straight into more danger. The quiet stretched on for what felt like an eternity, each moment pressing against her like the suffocating weight of a storm cloud. Every now and then, she thought she heard a faint noise outside the cave, something moving, just on the edge of her hearing. But when she strained her ears to listen, the sound would stop. Hours passed, and the fire slowly burned down to embers. Jack was no longer standing guard, but sitting against the cave wall, his eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. The man was still alert, his body poised and tense, as if he were waiting for something to leap out of the darkness at any second. "We should get some rest," the man finally said, though it was clear from the look in his eyes that the words were more of a suggestion than a command. "We won't survive if we don't get a bit of sleep. But keep your ears open." Emma nodded, though the idea of closing her eyes in this place made her uneasy. She knew she needed rest, but every part of her screamed that sleep was dangerous here. But there was nothing else to do. The night had stretched on for far too long, and the exhaustion was unbearable. She closed her eyes, but the sounds of the forest, the low hum of distant growls, the snapping of twigs kept her on edge. She drifted in and out of a restless sleep, the nightmares she couldn't escape dancing on the edge of her thoughts. And then, in the middle of her uneasy slumber, something changed. A loud, bone-shaking growl echoed through the cave's entrance, so close it sent a shockwave of terror through her body. Emma's eyes snapped open, her heart thundering in her chest. Jack and the man were already on their feet, moving quickly, their eyes wide with a silent understanding. "They're here," the man whispered, his voice low but urgent. "And they brought something with them." Emma didn't need to ask what it was. The creatures had returned, and this time they weren't alone. The growl echoed through the cave again, louder this time, shaking the very earth beneath Emma's feet. Her breath caught in her throat, panic rising like a tidal wave in her chest. Every part of her screamed to run, to escape, but she couldn't. Her wheelchair was too bulky, and the path out of the cave was too narrow. They were trapped, with nowhere to go but deeper into the darkness. Jack grabbed the knife, his hand shaking only slightly as he held it tightly, preparing for whatever was coming. The man, who had remained eerily calm until now, seemed to be fighting a battle within himself. His eyes flicked from the entrance of the cave to Emma, his face taut with the weight of decisions yet to be made. "Stay quiet," the man whispered, his voice low and steady, yet tinged with a warning she couldn't ignore. "If we stay hidden, maybe they won't notice us." Emma's mind raced. She wanted to ask him what exactly they were, but she already knew the answer. The creatures. The ones with glowing eyes, the ones who hunted them in the woods, were closing in, and from the man's reaction, they were not just a simple threat. They were something far worse. The growl came again, this time closer, reverberating off the cave walls. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow and quick. The silence that followed felt like an eternity, each second stretching out longer than the last. The man stood up, moving swiftly toward the entrance. "Get ready," he said in a whisper, though it didn't sound like he was speaking to anyone in particular. "They're coming." Emma's eyes darted between the two men, fear tightening her throat. She wanted to do something, anything, but all she could do was wait and pray that they would survive whatever was about to happen. A rustle outside the cave, the sound of something heavy dragging across the ground, signaled that the creatures were getting closer. Jack's eyes narrowed as he watched the shadows play across the entrance. His fingers tightened around the knife. "Stay back," the man warned, positioning himself between Emma and the cave entrance. "If they get in here, we fight. But not until we have to." Suddenly, the air shifted. It was as if the world itself held its breath, the forest around them going deathly quiet. Emma could feel the temperature drop, an icy chill sweeping into the cave. The creatures were close, too close, and whatever had drawn them to this place was more terrifying than she could have ever imagined. The growls grew louder, their guttural tones vibrating through the air. Emma could hear the soft padding of feet, too many feet, circling them like wolves preparing for a kill. And then, a shape emerged from the shadows, slithering toward the cave entrance, its body impossibly long and covered in matted fur. Its eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, green and predatory. Its movements were slow, deliberate. Jack's hand gripped the knife tighter, but his voice faltered as he muttered under his breath, "What the hell is that thing?" The man's jaw clenched, and his eyes flashed with a mix of fear and determination. "That's not just a creature. It's the Alpha. The leader. We're not dealing with anything we've faced before." Emma's heart skipped a beat. The Alpha? The leader? Her mind spun as the realization hit her. The creatures they had encountered were part of something much larger, something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The Alpha paused just outside the cave, its eyes locking onto Emma. It sniffed the air, its head tilting slightly as if considering them. The air was thick with tension, every breath feeling like it could be their last. The man grabbed Jack's arm. "Wait for it," he muttered. "If it comes in here, we fight. But we need it to make the first move. Don't give it a reason." But before either of them could react, the Alpha let out a terrifying screech that echoed through the cave and into the forest, a sound so chilling it made Emma's skin crawl. The creature's claws scraped against the cave walls, and the shadows around them seemed to deepen, shifting in ways that defied logic. The man lunged forward, his movements swift and practiced. He threw a makeshift spear, crafted from a broken branch with a sharp rock affixed to its end, at the creature. The spear struck the Alpha's shoulder, drawing a hiss of pain from the beast, but it only seemed to enrage it more. With a speed that no human should have been capable of, the Alpha retaliated, its claws slashing through the air toward the man. The man dodged just in time, rolling to the side, but the Alpha's claws tore into the ground where he had been standing. "Now," the man shouted, his voice sharp. "Fight." Without hesitation, Jack surged forward, knife in hand. The Alpha bared its teeth, a flash of razor-sharp fangs, and lunged at Jack with a terrifying roar. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to warn them, but her body was frozen, her mind paralyzed by fear. All she could do was watch as the battle unfolded before her eyes. Jack swung his knife with all his strength, aiming for the creature's throat. But the Alpha was too fast. It sidestepped, its body moving with an unnatural fluidity, and knocked Jack to the ground with a single swipe of its massive paw. The man dove in just as the Alpha turned toward him, using the moment of distraction to thrust the spear into the creature's side. The Alpha let out an agonized howl, but it wasn't enough to stop it. The creature's strength was overwhelming, and it threw the man back into the cave's stone wall with a deafening crash. "Emma." The man's voice was hoarse, filled with pain, but there was something else in it, a sense of urgency. "Get out of here. Run." But Emma couldn't move. Her heart ached as she watched the chaos unfold before her. Jack was struggling to get back on his feet, and the man, despite his injuries, was still trying to protect her. She had never felt more helpless in her life. The Alpha, sensing its victory, began to advance on Jack, its claws gleaming in the dim firelight. Jack was barely able to raise his knife in defense, blood streaming from a deep wound on his arm. It was then that Emma realized something. She couldn't just sit there and watch them die. This wasn't the end. Not yet. With all the strength she could muster, she wheeled herself toward the entrance of the cave, her heart pounding in her chest. Her legs were weak, her body trembling, but she had to do something. She reached into the pack the man had left by her chair and found what she was looking for, a flare. She grabbed it, twisting the top to activate it. A burst of bright light filled the cave, and the Alpha paused, startled by the sudden flare of brightness. Emma threw the flare with every ounce of strength she had left, hurling it directly at the Alpha's face. The creature recoiled, howling in fury, giving Jack and the man the precious seconds they needed to regroup. The distraction was brief, but it was enough. The man seized the opportunity, lunging with the spear once more, and this time it found its mark. The alpha let out one final screech before collapsing to the ground, twitching violently before it fell still. The battle was over. The cave fell silent again, except for the heavy breathing of the survivors. Jack slowly pushed himself to his feet, his face pale, but alive. The man, bloodied and bruised, stood shakily beside him, his face a mix of relief and exhaustion. Emma looked at them, her body still shaking with the adrenaline of the fight. "We did it," she whispered, though her voice barely reached above a rasp. Jack nodded slowly. "Yeah, we did." But as the alpha's body lay motionless, Emma knew that their fight wasn't over. The forest, the creatures, and whatever else lurked in the shadows of this place would still be out there, waiting. They had survived for now, but the road ahead was uncertain. And Emma? She knew one thing for certain. No matter what happened next, she wasn't going to be alone anymore. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?